The Tower of London loomed against the grey sky, its stone walls soaked with centuries of whispers. To the casual eye, it stood as a fortress and royal residence, but for those unlucky enough to pass through its gates, it became a place where the human body and spirit were broken. The tower was not built solely for kings and queens. Its dungeons became chambers of fear where iron tools gleamed with cruel purpose. Within these walls, justice and punishment blended into something darker, a spectacle meant to terrify all who dared challenge the crown. At the heart of the tower's legend stood the rack, the most infamous device of its kind. A wooden frame, massive and merciless, held ropes wound tight with iron rollers. When the levers turned, the prisoner's limbs stretched beyond nature's limits until bones snapped and joints tore apart. The rack was not meant to kill quickly. It was designed to leave a body twisted and broken, unable to move. Muscles tore, tendons screamed, and the victim's cries echoed against the stone, carrying up to the guards in the courtyard. This was not execution, it was endurance of agony. One of the earliest victims to face the rack was John Gerard, a Jesuit priest accused of treason in Elizabethan England. Bound by his faith, he refused to confess to aiding Catholic rebels. The rack was meant to shatter his silence, pulling his body further apart with every turn of the wheel. Gerard described later how his shoulders dislocated, how the cords cut into his skin, yet even as his body broke, his spirit did not. He fainted from pain, revived, and endured the torment all over again. His survival made him a legend, though his scars spoke louder than any tale. The rack was only one face of the tower's cruelty. Another invention, equally sinister but opposite in design, was the Scavenger's daughter. While the rack pulled a body apart, this iron device crushed it inward. Victims were forced to kneel as a metal hoop folded them into themselves. Limbs pressed against chest, chest against thighs, and head bent forward, all locked into iron. Blood vessels burst under the strain, forcing crimson from nose, ears, and mouth. The crushing silence of the chamber carried no screams, only muffled groans and the drip of blood on stone floors. The Scavenger's daughter was often used alongside the rack, where one stretched, the other compacted, and prisoners sometimes faced both in cruel alternation. The body became a battleground of extremes, stretched and crushed until it was nothing but broken matter in the hands of royal justice. The tower's torturers were not mindless brutes. They were trained men, sworn to extract confessions without killing too quickly. Their art lay in prolonging agony, tightening ropes inch by inch, adjusting iron clasps to keep blood flowing, ensuring their victims would live long enough to speak. In the reign of Henry VIII, the tower filled with prisoners accused of treason, heresy, and betrayal. Noblemen who once dined with the king now tasted the cold stone of the dungeons. Queens like Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard walked its corridors, knowing torture was reserved for those who defied silently. The damp air of the lower chambers mixed with the stench of sweat, rot, and burning tallow. Rats scurried through the straw bedding of cells, feeding on scraps dropped by guards. Shackles lined the walls, iron rings clinking whenever a prisoner shifted in restless misery. Confessions were written in trembling hands, often dictated by the torturer himself. Words inked with blood and desperation sealed a prisoner's fate. Truth mattered little. What mattered was submission, the breaking of will, the demonstration that no man or woman could stand against the English crown. Yet the tower's cruelty was not always hidden in the dungeon. Public displays were common, designed to remind Londoners of their place beneath royal power. Prisoners, mangled by rack or iron, were dragged before crowds to confess sins they may never have committed. Fear was the true punishment. The clanging of chains, the crack of whips, the turn of iron screws, all were sounds that haunted those who lived near the tower. Mothers warned their children to behave, lest they be dragged to the fortress. The tower's shadow stretched far beyond its walls, gripping the city in terror. For the prisoners themselves, time lost meaning. Days blurred into nights as pain consumed them. Hope drained as footsteps echoed outside their cells, each one a reminder that torture could begin again. The faint light through barred windows offered no comfort, only a reminder of freedom forever out of reach. Some prisoners did not survive the rack or the Scavenger's daughter. Bodies collapsed under strain, hearts gave out or lungs filled with blood. For those who did, survival often meant execution anyway, beheading, hanging, or burning. Torture was not always the end, but it was rarely the beginning of mercy. Still, the tower was not only a place of cruelty, it was also a stage for resilience. Men and women who endured its horrors left behind stories of faith unbroken, loyalty unshaken, and defiance that even steel could not crush. Their whispers carried through history, testifying to human endurance. The rack and the scavenger's daughter defined the tower's reputation, symbols of a monarchy that ruled through terror. They were tools, not of justice but of fear, a reminder that the crown's reach was absolute. The walls of the tower kept these secrets, but the stones remembered. And so the Tower of London stood, both fortress and dungeon, palace and pit. Its gates welcomed kings with golden crowns and dragged traitors in chains. Beneath its floors, history was written not only with ink and parchment, but with screams carved deep into its very stone. The Tower of London was more than stone walls. It was a web of corridors where fear seeped through every crack. Guards knew their footsteps echoed with dread, and prisoners listened in silence, waiting for the next summons that could end in blood or chains. Among the infamous prisoners brought to its depths was Guy Fawkes, the man behind the gunpowder plot of 1605. His capture electrified England, and the tower became his cage. The rack awaited him, its wheels turning in anticipation of tearing out the secrets of the conspiracy. Dragged into the chamber, Fawkes faced the heavy timber frame. Bound at wrists and ankles, his body was stretched inch by inch. His silence broke under the agony, his signature on his confession reduced to a shaky scrawl. The tower had once again proven its role as the crown's merciless servant. Yet Guy Fawkes was not alone in tasting the tower's cruelty. Countless others followed, noblemen and commoners alike. One such prisoner was Robert Southwell, a Jesuit priest who faced both the rack and the scavenger's daughter. His faith was strong, but iron was stronger, crushing his body until blood trickled from his face. For the guards and torturers, this was a duty as much as it was a performance. They worked under orders, recording the prisoner's words while adjusting the tension of ropes and screws. Some were coldly professional, others disturbingly eager. Each saw themselves as instruments of the crown's justice. The scavenger's daughter, though less known than the rack, was perhaps more terrifying. Witnesses described the silence of its victims, the way screams were stifled as blood vessels burst. It was a punishment designed to make the body collapse inward, a gruesome mirror to the rack's outward destruction. Cells deep in the tower held more than chains and straw. They carried echoes of every confession forced within them. The dungeons smelled of damp earth, mildew, and rusting iron. Each sent a reminder of how long prisoners languished without hope of release. Some cells were so small that prisoners could barely move. Kneeling or crouching for days, their muscles stiffened until even standing became impossible. Shackles dug into ankles and wrists, leaving sores that festered in the cold air. The tower was as much a slow death as it was a sudden torment. The Bloody Tower, one of its most feared sections, was whispered to be cursed. It was here that two young princes, Edward V and his brother Richard, mysteriously disappeared in 1483. Though their fate remains uncertain, the tower's reputation grew darker, shrouding every chamber in tales of betrayal. To the outside world, the tower's executions were spectacles. Prisoners, mangled by torture, often faced public death on Tower Hill. The crowd gathered in grim fascination, their cheers and gasps blending with the final words of the condemned. The spectacle of violence reminded all of London who held power. Inside, the torture chambers worked quietly but effectively. A prisoner's body was not always destroyed. Sometimes the mere threat was enough. Chains rattled, levers creaked, and victims confessed before the devices even touched them. The imagination of pain could be as effective as the pain itself. The tower was also home to psychological torment. Prisoners knew executions loomed outside their barred windows. They heard the cries of others and smelled the smoke of burning pyres. Each sound carved into their minds, a reminder that their fate was sealed long before the torturer's hand reached for them. Torturers sometimes spoke calmly to their victims, as though offering them a choice. confess and lessen the pain, or resist and face the tools again. It was a cruel negotiation, one in which the prisoner never truly won. Every option ended in humiliation, ruin, or death, yet resistance still lived within the walls. Some, like Thomas More, held to their beliefs until the end. While More was spared the rack, he knew the tower's methods well. His refusal to betray his conscience became a story of defiance, echoing far louder than the torturer's chains. Women too faced the tower's cruelty, though often differently than men. Anne Askew, a Protestant martyr, was stretched on the rack so severely that her bones cracked. She had to be carried to her execution, her body destroyed but her spirit unbroken. Her name became a testament to faith's endurance. The tower's cruelty was not only physical, it was political. Each act of torture carried a message. No rebellion would go unanswered, no defiance would go unseen. Bodies were not simply broken, they were displayed as living warnings, instruments of control over an uneasy kingdom. Every monarch who ruled saw the tower as a necessary evil. Henry VIII filled its dungeons with traitors. Elizabeth Feward used it to silence Catholic conspirators. James the Thorn made it a cage for those who plotted in shadows. Each ruler stained the stones with new layers of fear. At night, the tower grew eerily silent. Guards patrolled with lanterns, the flame flickering against cold walls. Prisoners lay awake in the dark, the clang of chains echoing faintly. Sleep offered no comfort, only nightmares where racks creaked and iron hoops closed once again around their flesh. Even centuries later, the stones of the tower seem to remember. Tourists walk its halls now, marveling at its history, unaware of how many screams once filled these same corridors. Beneath their feet, echoes of broken bodies linger, whispering stories of those who never walked free again. By the 17th century, the Tower of London's reputation as a dungeon of horrors was firmly sealed. Its name alone was enough to silence conversations in taverns and strike fear into even the boldest men. Yet history was shifting, and with it, the tower's role in punishment began to change. The rack, once the centerpiece of interrogation, fell gradually into disuse. As England entered a more legalistic age, open torture became harder to justify. Still, the heavy wooden frame lingered in the tower's chambers, a silent threat, its ropes frayed but ready should a monarch demand its service. The last official use of the rack came in 1628, when it was prepared for John Felton, the man who assassinated the Duke of Buckingham. Yet even then, the king's advisors hesitated. Public sentiment was changing, and the spectacle of shattered bodies no longer served its purpose. Felton was spared the rack. Still, the tower continued to swallow prisoners whole. Men accused of treason, conspiracy, and heresy filled its cells, even if torture itself was waning. The tower remained a cage of fear, a place where noblemen were stripped of dignity and left to rot in silence. Torture may have declined, but executions persisted. Tower Hill saw a steady stream of prisoners meeting the axe. Nobility and commoners alike knelt before the crowd, the thud of the blade signaling the crown's power. The tower's identity as a place of suffering endured, even without the rack's cruel embrace. For women, the tower remained a stage of dread. Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days' Queen, was imprisoned here before her beheading. Anne Boleyn walked its corridors, knowing the end awaited her. Though the rack did not claim them, the tower's walls pressed heavily on their final days. The Scavenger's daughter too fell into obscurity, though its iron form remained. Visitors whispered of its use, of blood dripping from its victims, of bodies folded into impossible shapes. Even as torture declined, the memory of the device haunted those who entered its darkened chambers. As the Enlightenment spread across Europe, attitudes toward torture shifted. It was seen less as justice and more as barbarity. The Tower of London, once a symbol of control, now risked becoming a relic of cruelty. Kings and queens adapted, but the scars of centuries could not be erased. Prisoners still suffered, though in subtler ways. Isolation, damp cells, and the looming threat of execution proved as effective as iron tools. The psychological weight of the tower became its own form of torment, breaking spirits without the need for shattered bones. By the 18th century, the tower's role transformed further. No longer a center for interrogation, it became a military fortress and arsenal. Its dungeons grew quieter, though the memories of its victims clung to the walls like a shadow that refused to fade. Yet stories of ghosts and echoes persisted. Guards swore they heard footsteps in empty halls, whispers in chambers long abandoned. Some claimed to see Anne Boleyn's figure drifting along the green, her head carried under her arm. The tower's history refused to rest, bleeding into legend. Visitors came to gawk at its history, to marvel at its architecture, but they also felt its weight. The stones themselves seemed alive, carrying the imprint of centuries of agony. Tourists whispered nervously, as though raising their voices might awaken the screams buried deep within the walls. Even the Crown recognized the tower's grim legacy. Efforts were made to preserve it not only as a fortress, but as a monument to history, dark, brutal, and unforgettable. Its torture devices were kept, displayed as relics of a time when justice bowed to cruelty. The rack, the scavenger's daughter, and iron shackles became museum pieces. Children pointed at them in horror, unable to imagine the suffering they once inflicted. Guides spoke of Guy Fawkes, Anne Askew, and countless nameless prisoners whose cries had vanished into silence. Yet the tower remained more than a museum. It was a warning etched in stone. Its past reminded England of the dangers of unchecked power, of the cruelty born when kings and queens wielded fear as their greatest weapon. The tower's history was not forgotten, it was taught. And still the tower endured. It stood through revolutions, wars, and centuries of change, its walls unmoving while the world transformed outside. Within, the memories of torture and death remained locked, a grim testament to what humanity was once willing to inflict in the name of order. Today, visitors walk freely where prisoners once shuffled in chains. They see the crown jewels, the royal armor, the storied ravens. Yet beneath the surface lies another tower, invisible but present, the Tower of Screams, of iron, of bodies stretched and crushed beyond recognition. The Tower of London is no longer a dungeon of royal tortures, but its shadow endures. Every creak of its gates, every echo in its corridors, carries with it the weight of centuries. It is both a monument and a warning, a reminder that power, when wielded without mercy, leaves only blood and silence behind. And so the tower stands, unyielding and eternal, a fortress of kings, a prison of traitors, a theater of agony. Its story is carved not only in stone, but in the broken bodies of those who never walked free. The tower remembers, even when the world tries to forget.